3 days after the storm finally released its grip on northern Minnesota, the rescue crews found Eleanor Whitaker's farmhouse still standing, while almost every modern home along the county road sat dark, frozen, and broken beneath mountains of ice-packed snow. The National Guard officers could barely believe what they were seeing. The windows of the little white farmhouse glowed amber against the gray dawn, thin smoke drifting steadily from the chimney into air so cold it burned the lungs to breathe. Around the entire stone foundation of the house stood a massive wall of tightly stacked cordwood nearly 3 feet deep, frozen solid like a fortress built by hand against winter itself. Inside, 7 people huddled near a cast-iron stove drinking hot coffee, while the temperature outside lingered near 40 below. At the center of them all sat 71-year-old Eleanor, Ellie, Whitaker wrapped in an old flannel blanket, calmly feeding another split log into the fire, as if surviving one of the worst Arctic cyclones in Minnesota history was simply another chore to complete before supper. But only a week earlier, nearly everyone in town had laughed at her. It began during the strange warmth of late October when the first warning signs appeared, signs most people either ignored or never noticed at all. The geese left Lake Superior almost 2 weeks earlier than usual. The pine squirrels stripped entire branches bare in frantic bursts of activity. Even the wind felt different, carrying a dry metallic edge that reminded Ellie of winters she had hoped never to see again. Every morning before sunrise, she would stand quietly on her back porch holding a chipped coffee mug between stiff arthritic fingers while staring at the dark tree line beyond her property. Something about the silence bothered her. It was too still, too heavy. Her late husband Frank used to say the wilderness always whispered before it screamed, and after living through 50 Minnesota winters beside him, Ellie had learned to listen. So while the younger families in town continued scrolling through weather apps promising a milder than average season, Ellie began stacking firewood around the entire base of her farmhouse. Not casually, methodically, every piece measured, fitted, and packed tight against the outer perimeter until the wall rose nearly to her waist. By the second week, it wrapped around the whole house like a wooden barricade. Drivers slowed along County Road 14 just to stare. Some even stopped to take pictures. Ellie ignored them all and kept working. Her old leather gloves darkened with sap and dirt as she hauled another armload from the splitting shed behind the bar. At Harold's Diner in town, the jokes spread quickly. Old Ellie's finally lost it. One truck mechanic laughed over coffee, building herself a log castle for the apocalypse. Others joined in. A young outdoors influencer named Derek Lawson, who had moved from Minneapolis the year before hoping to build a social media channel around rugged country living, filmed a video from his pickup truck while pointing his camera toward Ellie's property in the background. "You guys seeing this?" He chuckled into the lens. "Apparently Grandma Whitaker thinks winter's gonna invade Normandy." The video gained thousands of views in 2 days, and people around town began calling the farmhouse Fort Ellie whenever she wasn't around. Ellie heard every joke. She simply kept stacking wood. What none of them understood was that the cordwood itself was only part of the plan. Frank had taught her decades ago that trapped dead air could preserve heat better than almost anything else in a blizzard. During the brutal winter of 1978, when temperatures plunged so low that diesel fuel turned to gel in farm equipment across the county, Frank had insulated their crawl space using stacked timber and packed snow after the furnace failed for nearly 3 days. Wind steals heat faster than cold ever will, he had told her while hammering boards beneath the porch with frost hanging from his beard. Ellie never forgot it. Now, moving slowly but deliberately at 71 years old, she recreated the same protective barrier around their aging farmhouse because instinct told her something dangerous was coming. Every evening after stacking wood, she prepared the inside of the house with equal precision. She filled glass jars with water. She charged battery lanterns. She labeled canned soup and vegetables with thick black marker so they could be found easily in low light. She tested her emergency radio twice a day and reinforced the back windows with plywood salvage from the old chicken coop. Meanwhile, the newer homes outside town glowed with expensive conveniences: smart thermostats, backup generators, internet-controlled heating systems. Megan and Todd Rayner, wealthy transplants from Chicago building a massive modern vacation home near the lake, openly mocked Ellie during a hardware store conversation after seeing her buy extra chimney brushes and pipe insulation. You know they make central heating now, right? Todd joked with a grin while loading designer light fixtures into his SUV. Ellie only smiled politely. Electricity's wonderful, she replied softly. Until it isn't. Sheriff Bill Carver was one of the few people who didn't laugh. He had known Ellie for decades and respected the quiet seriousness behind her eyes. When he stopped beside her property one windy afternoon and saw the growing cordwood wall nearly complete, he leaned against his cruiser door and frowned toward the darkening northern sky. "You really think it's going to get that bad?" he asked. Ellie rested both hands atop the handle of her splitting maul before answering. "I think folks forgot what winter can do when it wants to remind you." Bill glanced again at the sky. For the first time all week, he looked uneasy. 2 nights later, the National Weather Service interrupted every television and radio station across northern Minnesota with an emergency bulletin warning of a rapidly intensifying Arctic cyclone expected to produce life-threatening whiteout conditions, catastrophic wind chills, and widespread infrastructure failure across the region. Grocery stores filled within hours. Gas stations ran dry before midnight. Yet even then, many residents still treated the storm like another overhyped forecast that would fade by morning. Derek Lawson uploaded one final joking video from inside his heated garage while snowflakes drifted past the open door behind him. "If I disappear," he laughed to his viewers, "tell Ellie Whitaker she was right." By dawn the next morning, nobody was laughing anymore. The wind arrived first, roaring across the frozen fields hard enough to shake entire houses. Then came the snow, thick and relentless, swallowing roads, fences, and vehicles beneath blinding waves of white. Power lines snapped one after another across the county. Cell service vanished before noon. Temperatures crashed so violently that exposed skin froze within minutes. And as darkness fell over northern Minnesota, Ellie Whitaker quietly lit the oil lamps inside her little farmhouse, checked the stacked cordwood surrounding her foundation one final time, and listened as the storm began trying to tear the world apart. By the second night of the storm, the entire county had disappeared beneath a blinding white wilderness so violent and unforgiving that even longtime residents struggled to recognize the land around them. The wind no longer sounded natural. It screamed across the frozen fields like steel grinding against steel, rattling windows hard enough to crack old glass, and piling snow against buildings faster than people could shovel it away. Somewhere beyond the darkness, transformers exploded one after another with eerie blue flashes that briefly illuminated the storm clouds before vanishing again into the whiteout. Temperatures had fallen so low that Sheriff Bill Carver later described the air itself as poison. Outside Ellie Whitaker's farmhouse, drifts climbed nearly halfway up the porch railing. But inside, the old cast-iron stove radiated steady heat through the small living room, while kerosene lamps painted soft amber light across the walls. Ellie sat bundled in a wool sweater near the stove, sharpening a hand axe with slow, practiced strokes, while her battery-powered radio crackled with emergency alerts warning residents to shelter in place because road crews could no longer reach stranded areas. The cordwood stacked around the foundation had frozen into a solid insulating barrier, blocking the brutal crosswinds that ripped through neighboring properties. Every few hours, Ellie checked the crawl space temperature with an old analog thermometer Frank once used during blizzards decades earlier. The reading remained stable. Her pipes were safe. Her water still ran. Meanwhile, less than a mile away, panic had begun spreading through the newer homes along County Road 14. Derek Lawson's carefully crafted image of rugged outdoor self-sufficiency collapsed almost immediately after the power failed. His diesel truck refused to start in the deep cold. The battery drained nearly dead despite repeated attempts to crank the engine. Then his backup generator froze after blowing a fuel line during the night. By morning, the inside temperature of his house had dropped into the 40s and continued falling fast. He filmed updates for his followers at first, wrapping himself in blankets while trying to laugh through visible fear, but the humor faded from his voice once ice began forming along the inside edges of his windows. His pipes burst shortly after noon with a loud crack behind the kitchen wall, spraying water that froze almost instantly across the floorboards. By sunset, his phone battery had nearly died, and for the first time since moving to Minnesota, Derek understood how quickly winter could turn deadly. Across the road, Megan and Todd Rayner faced a different kind of disaster inside their massive lakefront vacation home. Designed more for magazine photographs than survival, the sleek modern structure depended almost entirely on electricity. The smart heating system failed within hours of the outage. The giant floor-to-ceiling windows that once showcased beautiful lake views now leaked cold through every seam. Around midnight, one enormous pane cracked from top to bottom with a sound like a rifle shot, as the brutal temperature difference stressed the glass beyond its limit. Wind-driven snow blasted through the fracture into the living room, coating expensive hardwood floors in ice crystals while the indoor temperature plunged. Todd spent hours trying to restart the backup systems using flashlight instructions from his phone before realizing the internet connection was completely gone. Megan sat wrapped in coats near the kitchen island fighting back tears as darkness swallowed room after room inside the enormous house. But inside Ellie's farmhouse, the storm meant something stronger than modern convenience. It meant preparation. Every movement Ellie made had purpose. She cooked simple meals slowly to conserve fuel. She rotated lantern batteries according to handwritten schedules taped beside the pantry. She melted extra snow in metal pots as backup water, even though her pipes still worked. At night, she slept lightly in a chair near the stove, waking every hour to feed the fire before the house temperature could drop. The old farmhouse groaned constantly beneath the force of the wind, but the thick cordwood surrounding the foundation absorbed much of the cold that would otherwise have seeped through the floorboards. Frank had been right all those years ago. Dead air space saved lives. On the third night, the storm intensified even further. Wind gusts nearing 80 miles per hour slammed against the property hard enough to shake dishes inside the cabinets. Ellie had just finished checking the chimney draft when she heard a faint sound beneath the roar outside. At first she thought it was another branch striking the porch, but then it came again. Knocking. Weak. Irregular. Human. She grabbed the lantern and moved carefully toward the front door, every instinct warning her not to open it during a blizzard powerful enough to rip doors from hinges. Pulling back the curtain, she froze. A figure stood bent against the storm, barely visible through the blowing snow. Ellie unlocked the deadbolt and forced the door open against the pressure of the wind. Derek Lawson stumbled inside almost immediately, collapsing to one knee on the braided rug while snow spilled across the floor around him. His beard was coated in ice, so thick it looked white. His gloves were stiff as wood. Behind him appeared Megan and Todd, both wrapped in blankets and barely able to stand upright after walking through waist-deep drifts from their stranded SUV farther down the road. The moment Ellie shut the door, the storm disappeared into muffled silence behind the heavy walls of the farmhouse. For several seconds nobody spoke. Derek simply stared at the glowing stove with bloodshot eyes while his shaking hands hovered near the heat. Megan quietly began crying from exhaustion. Todd looked around the small room in disbelief. The house was warm, not luxurious, not modern, but warm enough to survive. Ellie moved immediately into action without wasting words. She handed them dry blankets, hot water, thick wool socks from an old cedar chest. Then she ladled canned beef stew into bowls while Derek sat staring at the fire like a man rescued from the ocean. Eventually his eyes drifted toward the frost-covered windows, and then to the walls lined with carefully organized supplies. Stacked firewood, lanterns, extra blankets, handwritten notebooks filled with dates, and weather records going back decades. Framed photographs of Ellie and Frank standing beside snowbanks taller than trucks during storms long before smartphones and weather apps existed. "You knew," Derek finally whispered hoarsely. Ellie shook her head while adjusting the stove damper. "No," she answered quietly. "I just remembered." The words settled heavily over the room. Outside, the blizzard continued swallowing the world. Around 2 a.m., a distant explosion echoed through the storm, followed by a brief orange glow against the clouds. A propane tank somewhere nearby had detonated. Megan flinched in fear while Todd moved toward the window before Ellie stopped him. "Stay away from the glass," she warned. Minutes later, the emergency radio crackled alive with static before Sheriff Bill Carver's strained voice finally broke through. Multiple roads were completely impassable. Utility crews had pulled back. Rescue teams could not safely reach several rural areas until the storm weakened. Then came the sentence that silenced the entire room. Earliest assistance estimate is another 48 hours. Bill said through bursts of interference. Maybe longer. Derek slowly lowered his head into his hands. Megan stared blankly at the floor. Todd exhaled sharply through clenched teeth. But Ellie simply reached for another piece of firewood and fed it calmly into the stove while the flames rose brighter against the darkness. Because unlike the others, she understood something they were only beginning to learn. The storm was not finished with them yet. By the fourth day, the storm had transformed the isolated stretch of northern Minnesota into something that no longer felt connected to the modern world. Roads had vanished beneath towering drifts. Power poles lay snapped across frozen ditches like broken matchsticks. Entire sections of forest had been flattened by ice-coated winds so violent that even the rescue helicopters waiting farther south could not safely fly. Inside Ellie Whitaker's farmhouse, however, life settled into a strange rhythm of survival. The little house had become more than shelter. It had become the last warm place for miles. Every morning before sunrise, Ellie woke first to feed the cast-iron stove, while the others slept beneath layers of blankets spread across the living room floor. The cordwood surrounding the foundation continued doing exactly what Frank had designed it to do decades earlier, trapping insulation around the base of the house and shielding the floors from the murderous cold clawing at the walls outside. Frost still crept across the corners of the windows overnight, but the indoor temperature remained survivable. In any other house nearby, they likely would have frozen already. The dynamic among the group changed quickly once fear gave way to exhaustion. Derek Lawson no longer acted like a man performing for an audience. The storm had stripped away the sarcasm, the cameras, and the carefully crafted confidence he once wore online. Instead, he spent hours beside Ellie learning how to split kindling properly without wasting energy. Todd repaired loose storm shutters using scavenged nails from Ellie's barn, while Megan organized food portions and melted snow for washing water. The farmhouse operated almost like a ship trapped in ice. Every person assigned a task because wasted movement meant wasted heat, and wasted heat could become deadly. Ellie guided them through it all with calm authority born from experience rather than panic. She taught them how to layer clothing to trap body heat, how to recognize the pale waxy signs of frostbite before tissue damage began, and why they should never sweat while working outside because damp clothes could kill a person faster than the cold itself. At night, while the wind hammered the house hard enough to rattle the rafters, the others listened to Ellie tell stories about winters most people have forgotten. She spoke about the blizzard of 1978, when farmers lost entire herds beneath snowdrifts taller than barns. She remembered a January storm in 1982 that froze fuel lines across half the county and trapped schoolchildren overnight inside a church basement. Frank used to say winter wasn't evil. She explained quietly one evening while staring into the stove flames. Winter's honest. It'll kill you the second you stop respecting it. Derek listened more closely than anyone. The woman he once mocked online now seemed stronger than every younger person in the room combined. On the fifth night, just as the storm finally showed signs of weakening, a new danger emerged without warning. Ellie noticed it first while placing another log into the stove shortly after midnight. The fire wasn't drafting properly. Instead of pulling upward through the chimney, thin gray smoke drifted lazily back into the room. Within minutes, the air began smelling sharp and bitter. Todd opened the stove door to adjust the burn, and a thick cloud of smoke rolled outward across the ceiling. Megan started coughing immediately. Derek's eyes watered from the fumes. Ellie moved fast, grabbing the carbon monoxide detector she kept beside the pantry. The alarm began chirping almost instantly. Ice. The chimney cap had partially frozen shut from days of relentless snow and sub-zero wind. If the blockage worsened, carbon monoxide would silently fill the farmhouse before morning. Opening windows for ventilation would drop the indoor temperature dangerously fast. Without the stove, they would lose their only reliable heat source. For the first time since the storm began, even Ellie looked worried. We need to clear it. Now, she said firmly while reaching for her winter coat. Todd stared at her in disbelief. In this, he asked as the wind howled outside hard enough to shake the porch walls. You can barely stand up out there. Ellie ignored him and grabbed a coil of rope from beside the mudroom door. Derek stood immediately. I'm going with you. Minutes later, they stepped outside into a world that looked almost unreal beneath the moonlit storm clouds. Snow blasted sideways across the property in glittering sheets while the cold sliced through every layer of clothing like knives. The drifts had buried half the porch. Ellie tied one end of the rope around her waist and handed the other to Derek. "If I slip," she shouted over the wind, "you hold on no matter what." Then, at 71 years old, Eleanor Whitaker climbed onto the frozen roof of her farmhouse while the storm still raged around them. Derek watched in stunned silence as she crawled carefully through the ice toward the chimney, using movements that looked practiced despite the danger. The wind nearly knocked her sideways twice. Snow blinded them both so badly that the roof edge vanished completely beneath swirling white gusts. Finally, Ellie reached the chimney cap and began hacking away frozen buildup with a small iron tool pulled from her coat pocket. Smoke burst upward almost immediately as the blockage cracked apart. "More!" Derek yelled. Ellie kept working with bare determination, smashing away ice while the rope strained tight against the wind. Suddenly, her foot slipped on the frozen shingles. Derek felt the rope jerk violently through his gloves as Ellie slid several feet toward the roof edge before slamming one hand against the chimney pipe and catching herself. For one terrifying second, neither of them moved. Then Ellie pulled herself upright again and kept clearing the ice as if fear simply wasn't allowed to matter anymore. Moments later, thick smoke finally surged cleanly from the chimney into the freezing night sky. The draft had returned. When they stumbled back inside the farmhouse, Megan burst into tears at the sight of them both covered in snow and ice. Todd helped Derek shut the door, while Ellie quietly removed her gloves with shaking hands blackened from soot and frost. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Derek looked directly at her and said the words nobody else had managed to admit until that moment. "You saved all of us." Ellie simply shrugged while moving back toward the stove. "No," she replied softly. "The house did." The next morning, the wind finally began to weaken. By afternoon, distant engine noises echoed faintly through the frozen valley for the first time in nearly a week. National Guard rescue vehicles slowly pushed down County Road 14 behind massive snowplows, carving pathways through drifts taller than the trucks themselves. When the crews finally reached Ellie's property, the soldiers stepped out in disbelief. Most nearby homes sat dark and abandoned with shattered pipes, collapsed roofs, and walls coated in ice from burst plumbing. The Rayner vacation home had suffered major structural damage after part of the heating system failed completely. Derek's house was unlivable, but Ellie's farmhouse still stood warm beneath thin curls of chimney smoke. The massive wall of cordwood surrounding the foundation had frozen into a solid protective barrier, exactly as intended. One rescue worker reportedly muttered, "Looks like the only house built to survive this thing." Weeks later, after the roads reopened and electricity finally returned across the county, Derek Lawson uploaded another video online. But this time there were no jokes, no sarcasm, and no performance. Sitting quietly inside Ellie's farmhouse beside the same cast iron stove, he looked directly into the camera and said, "We thought she was preparing out of fear. Truth is, she prepared out of respect. Respect for winter. Respect for nature. Respect for lessons people forgot the second life became comfortable." The video spread far beyond Minnesota. News stations called Ellie the woman who outsmarted the storm. Reporters requested interviews. Survival experts praised her methods. But Ellie ignored most of the attention. A month later, as another cold front drifted south from Canada, Sheriff Bill Carver passed her farmhouse one early morning and smiled at the familiar sight waiting beside the road. Eleanor Whitaker, 71 years old, was stacking fresh cordwood around her foundation once again, one careful piece at a time beneath the gray northern sky. Not because she was afraid, because she knew winter always comes back.